James II and VII was King of England and Ireland as James II and King of Scotland as James VII, for the 6th of February 1685 until he was deposed in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. He was the last Roman Catholic monarch to reign over the kingdoms of England, Scotland and Ireland. The second surviving son of Charles I, he ascended the throne upon the death of his brother Charles II. Members of Britain's Protestant political elite increasingly suspected him of being pro-French and pro-Catholic and of having designs on becoming an absolute monarch. When he produced a Catholic heir, leading nobles called on his Protestant son-in-law and nephew William of Orange to land an invasion army from the Netherlands, which he did in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. James fled England. He was replaced by his eldest Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange. James made one serious attempt to recover his crowns from William and Mary when he landed in Ireland in 1689. After the defeat of the Jacobite forces by the Williamites at the Battle of the Boyne in July 1690, James returned to France. He lived out the rest of his life as a pretender at a court sponsored by his cousin and ally King Louis XIV. James is best known for his struggles with the English Parliament and his attempts to create religious liberty for English Roman Catholics and Protestant nonconformists, against the wishes of the Anglican establishment. However, he also continued the persecution of the Presbyterian Covenanters in Scotland. Parliament opposed to the growth of absolutism that was occurring in other European countries, as well as to the loss of legal supremacy of the Church of England, saw their opposition as a way to preserve what they regarded as traditional English liberties. This tension made James's four-year reign a struggle for supremacy between the English Parliament and the Crown, resulting in his deposition, the passage of the Bill of Rights, and the accession of his daughter and her husband as King and Queen. Early life. Birth: James II, surviving son of King Charles I and his wife Henrietta Maria of France, was born at St. James's Palace in London on 14 October 1633. Later that same year, he was baptized by William Laud, the Anglican Archbishop of Canterbury. He was educated by private tutors, along with his brother, the future King Charles II, and the two sons of the Duke of Buckingham, George and Francis Villiers. At the age of 3, James was appointed Lord High Admiral. The position was initially honorary, but would become a substantive office after the Restoration. When James was an adult, he was designated Duke of York at birth, invested with the Order of the Garter in 1642, and formally created Duke of York in January 1644. Civil War. As the king's disputes with the English Parliament grew into the English Civil War, James stayed in Oxford, a royalist stronghold. When the city surrendered after the siege of Oxford in 1646, parliamentary leaders ordered the Duke of York to be confined in St. James's Palace. In 1648, he escaped from the palace, aided by Joseph Bampfield, and from there he went to The Hague in disguise. When Charles I was executed by the rebels in 1649, monarchists proclaimed James's older brother as Charles II of England. Charles II was recognized as king by the Parliament of Scotland and the Parliament of Ireland, and was crowned King of Scotland at Scone in 1651. Although he was proclaimed king in Jersey, Charles was unable to secure the crown of England and consequently fled to France in exile. Exile in France. Like his brother, James sought refuge in France, serving in the French army under Turenne against the Fronde, and later against the Spanish allies. In the French army, James had his first true experience of battle where, according to one observer, He ventures himself and chargeth gallantly where anything is to be done. In the meantime, Charles was attempting to reclaim his throne, but France, although hosting the exiles, had allied itself with Oliver Cromwell. In 1656, Charles turned instead to Spain, an enemy of France, for support, and an alliance was made. In consequence, James was expelled from France and forced to leave Turenne's army. James quarrelled with his brother over the diplomatic choice of Spain over France. Exiled and poor, there was little that either Charles or James could do about the wider political situation, and James ultimately travelled to Bruges and joined the Spanish army under Louis, Prince of Condé, fighting against his former French comrades at the Battle of the Dunes. During his service in the Spanish army, James became friendly with two Irish Catholic brothers in the royalist entourage, Peter and Richard Talbot, and became somewhat estranged from his brother's Anglican advisers. In 1659, the French and Spanish made peace. James, doubtful of his brother's chances of regaining the throne, considered taking a Spanish offer to be an admiral in the navy. Ultimately, he declined the position. By the next year, the situation in England had changed, and Charles II was proclaimed king. Restoration. First marriage after Richard Cromwell's resignation as Lord Protector in 1659 and the subsequent collapse of the Commonwealth in 1660. Charles II was restored to the English throne. Although James was the heir presumptive, it seemed unlikely that he would inherit the crown, as Charles was still a young man capable of fathering children. On the 31st of December 1660, following his brother's restoration, James was created Duke of Albany in Scotland, to go along with his English title, Duke of York. Upon his return to England, James prompted an immediate controversy by announcing his engagement to Anne Hyde, the daughter of Charles's chief minister Edward Hyde. In 1659, while trying to seduce her, James promised he would marry Anne. Anne became pregnant in 1660, but following the Restoration and James's return to power, no one at the royal court expected a prince to marry a commoner, no matter what he had pledged beforehand. Although nearly everyone, including Anne's father, urged the two not to marry, the couple married secretly, then went through an official marriage ceremony on the 3rd of September 1660 in London. The first child, Charles, was born less than 2 months later, but died in infancy, as did 5 further sons and daughters. Only 2 daughters survived, Mary and Anne. Samuel Pepys read that James was fond of his children and his role as a father, and played with them like an ordinary private father of a child, a contrast to the distant parenting common with royalty at the time. James's wife was devoted to him and influenced many of his decisions. Even so, he kept mistresses, including Arabella Churchill and Catherine Sedley, and was reputed to be the most unguarded ogler of his time. Anne Hyde died in 1671. Military and political offices. After the Restoration, James was confirmed as Lord High Admiral, an office that carried with it the subsidiary appointments of Governor of Portsmouth and Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports. James commanded the Royal Navy during the Second and Third Anglo-Dutch Wars. Following the raid on the Medway in 1667, James oversaw the survey and refortification of the southern coast. The office of Lord High Admiral, combined with his revenue from post office and wine tariffs, gave James enough money to keep a sizable court household. In 1664, Charles granted American territory between the Delaware and Connecticut rivers to James. Following its capture by the English, the former Dutch territory of New Netherland and its principal port is New Amsterdam were named the province and city of New York in James's honor. After the founding, the Duke gave part of the colony to proprietors George Carteret and John Berkeley. Fort Orange, 240 kilometers north on the Hudson River, was renamed Albany after James's Scottish title. In 1683, he became the governor of the Hudson's Bay Company, but did not take an active role in its governance. James also headed the Royal African Company, a slave trading company. In September 1666, his brother Charles put him in charge of firefighting operations in the Great Fire of London, in the absence of action by Lord Mayor Thomas Bloodworth. This was not a political office, but his actions and leadership were noteworthy. The Duke of York hath won the hearts of the people with his continual and indefatigable pains day and night in helping to quench the fire, wrote a witness in a letter on the 8th of September. Conversion to Roman Catholicism and second marriage. James's time in France had exposed him to the beliefs and ceremonies of Catholicism. He and his wife, Anne, became drawn to that faith. James took Eucharist in the Roman Catholic Church in 1668–1669, although his conversion was kept secret for some time and he continued to attend Anglican services until 1676. In spite of his conversion, James continued to associate primarily with Anglicans, including John Churchill and George Legge, as well as French Protestants, such as Louis de Jures, the Earl of Feversham. Growing fears of Catholic influence at court led the English Parliament to introduce a new Test Act in 1673. Under this act, all civil and military officials were required to take an oath and to receive the Eucharist under the auspices of the Church of England. James refused to perform either action, instead choosing to relinquish the post of Lord High Admiral. His conversion to Catholicism was thereby made public. Charles II opposed the conversion, ordering that James's daughters, Mary and Anne, be raised as Protestants. Nevertheless, he allowed James to marry the Catholic Mary of Modena, a 15-year-old Italian princess. James and Mary were married by proxy in a Catholic ceremony on the 20th of September 1673. On the 21st of November, Mary arrived in England and Nathaniel Crewe, Bishop of Oxford, performed a brief Anglican service that did little more than recognize a Catholic marriage. Many British people, distrustful of Catholicism, regarded the new Duchess of York as an agent of the Pope. James was noted for his devotion. He once said, "If occasion were, I hope God would give me his grace to suffer death for the true Catholic religion as well as banishment." Exclusion Crisis. In 1677, James reluctantly consented to his daughter Mary's marriage to the Protestant William of Orange, acquiescing after his brother Charles and William had agreed upon the marriage. Despite the Protestant marriage, fears of a potential Catholic monarch persisted, intensified by the failure of Charles II and his wife, Catherine of Braganza, to produce any children. A defrocked Anglican clergyman, Titus Oates, spoke of a popish plot to kill Charles and to put the Duke of York on the throne. The fabricated plot caused a wave of anti-Catholic hysteria to sweep across the nation. In England, the Earl of Shaftesbury, a former government minister and now a leading opponent of Catholicism, attempted to have James excluded from the line of succession. Some members of Parliament even proposed that the crown go to Charles's illegitimate son, James Scott, 1st Duke of Monmouth. In 1679, with the Exclusion Bill in danger of passing, Charles II dissolved Parliament. Two further parliaments were elected in 1680 and 1681, but were dissolved for the same reason. The Exclusion Crisis contributed to the development of the English two-party system. The Whigs were those who supported the bill, while the Tories were those who opposed it. Ultimately, the succession was not altered, but James was convinced to withdraw from all policy-making bodies and to accept a lesser role in his brother's government. On the orders of the king, James left England for Brussels. In 1680, he was appointed Lord Lord High Commissioner of Scotland and took up residence at the Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh to suppress an uprising and oversee royal government. James returned to England for a time when Charles was stricken ill and appeared to be near death. The hysteria of the accusations eventually faded, but James's relations with many in the English Parliament, including the Earl of Danby, a former ally, were forever strained and a solid segment turned against him returned to favour. In 1683, a plot was uncovered to assassinate Charles and James and spark a Republican revolution to re-establish a government of the Cromwellian style. The conspiracy, known as the Rye House Plot, backfired upon its conspirators and provoked a wave of sympathy for the King and James. Several notable Whigs, including the Earl of Essex and the King's illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth, were implicated. Monmouth initially confessed to complicity in the plot implicating fellow plotters, but later recanted. Essex committed suicide and Monmouth, along with several others, was obliged to flee into continental exile. Charles reacted to the plot by increasing repression of Whigs and dissenters. Taking advantage of James's rebounding popularity, Charles invited him back onto the Privy Council in 1684. While some in the English Parliament remained wary of the possibility of a Catholic king, the threat of excluding James from the throne had passed. Accession to the throne. Charles died in 1685 from apoplexy after converting to Catholicism on his deathbed. Having no legitimate children, Charles was succeeded by his brother James, who reigned in England and Ireland as James II, and in Scotland as James VII. There was little initial opposition to his accession, and there were widespread reports of public rejoicing at the orderly succession. James wanted to proceed quickly to the coronation, and was crowned with his wife at Westminster Abbey on the 23rd of April 1685. The new Parliament that assembled in May 1685, which gained the name of Loyal Parliament, was initially favourable to James, and the new king sent word that even most of the former exclusionists would be forgiven if they acquiesced to his rule. Most of Charles's officers continued in office, the exceptions being the promotion of James's brothers-in-law, the Earls of Clarendon and Rochester, and the demotion of Halifax. Parliament granted James a generous life income, including all of the proceeds of tonnage and poundage and the customs duties. James worked harder as king than his brother had, but was less willing to compromise when his advisers disagreed. Two rebellions. Soon after becoming king, James faced a rebellion in southern England led by his nephew, the Duke of Monmouth, and another rebellion in Scotland led by Archibald Campbell, the Earl of Argyll. Argyll and Monmouth both began their expeditions from Holland, where James's nephew and son-in-law, William of Orange, had neglected to detain them or put a stop to the recruitment efforts. Argyll sailed to Scotland and, on arriving there, raised recruits mainly from his own clan, the Campbells. The rebellion was quickly crushed, and Argyll was captured at Inchinnan on the 18th of June 1685. Having arrived with fewer than 300 men and unable to convince many more to flock to his standard, he never posed a credible threat to James. Argyll was taken as a prisoner to Edinburgh. A new trial was not commenced because Argyll had previously been tried and sentenced to death. The king confirmed the earlier death sentence and ordered that it be carried out within 3 days of receiving the confirmation. Monmouth's rebellion was coordinated with Argyll's, but the former was more dangerous to James. Monmouth had proclaimed himself king at Lyme Regis on the 11th of June. He attempted to raise recruits but was unable to gather enough rebels to defeat even James's small standing army. Monmouth's rebellion attacked the king's forces at night in an attempt at surprise, but was defeated at the Battle of Sedgemoor. The king's forces, led by Feversham and Churchill, quickly dispersed the ill-prepared rebels. Monmouth was captured and later executed at the Tower of London on 15 July. The king's judges, most notably George Jeffreys, condemned many of the rebels to transportation and indentured servitude in the West Indies in a series of trials that came to be known as the Bloody Assizes. Some 250 of the rebels were executed. While both rebellions were defeated easily, they hardened James's resolve against his enemies and increased his suspicion of the Dutch religious liberty and the dispensing power to protect himself from further rebellions. James sought safety by enlarging his standing army. This alarmed his subjects, not only because of the trouble soldiers caused in the towns, but because it was against the English tradition to keep a professional army in peacetime. Even more alarming to Parliament was James's use of his dispensing power to allow Roman Catholics to command several regiments without having to take the oath mandated by the Test Act. When even the previously supportive Parliament objected to these measures, James ordered Parliament prorogued in November 1685, never to meet again in his reign. In the beginning of 1686, 2 papers were found in Charles II's strong box and his closet, in his own hand, stating the arguments for Catholicism over Protestantism. James published these papers with a declaration signed by his sign manual and challenged the Archbishop of Canterbury and the whole Anglican Episcopal bench to refute Charles's arguments. Let me have a solid answer, and in a gentlemanlike style, and it may have the effect which you so much desire of bringing me over to your church. The Archbishop refused on the grounds of respect for the late king. James advocated repeal of the penal laws in all 3 of his kingdoms, but in the early years of his reign he refused to allow those dissenters who did not petition for relief to receive it. James sent a letter to the Scottish Parliament at its opening in 1685, declaring his wish for new penal laws against refractory Presbyterians and lamented that he was not there in person to promote such a law. In response, the Parliament passed an act that stated, whoever should preach in a conventicle under a roof, or should attend, either as preacher or as a hearer, a conventicle in the open air, should be punished with death and confiscation of property. In March 1686, James sent a letter to the Scottish Privy Council advocating toleration for Catholics but that the persecution of the Presbyterian Covenanters should be continued, calling them to London when they refused to acquiesce. The Privy Councillors explained that they would grant relief to Catholics only if a similar relief was provided for the Covenanters and if James promised not to attempt anything that would harm the Protestant religion. James agreed to a degree of relief to Presbyterians, but not to the full toleration he wanted for Catholics, declaring that the Protestant religion was false and he would not promise not to prejudice a false religion. James allowed Catholics to occupy the highest offices of the kingdoms, and received at his court the papal nuncio, Ferdinando d'Adda, the first representative from Rome to London since the reign of Mary I. James's Jesuit confessor, Edward Petre, was a particular object of Protestant ire. When the king's Secretary of State, the Earl of Sunderland, began replacing office holders at court with Catholic favourites, James began to lose the confidence of many of his Anglican supporters. Sunderland's purge of office holders even extended to the king's Anglican brothers-in-law and the supporters. Catholics made up no more than 1/50 of the English population. In May 1686, James sought to obtain a ruling from the English common law courts that showed his power to dispense with Acts of Parliament was legal. He dismissed judges who disagreed with him on this matter, as well as the Solicitor General Heneage Finch. The case, Godden v. Hales, affirmed his dispensing power, with 11 out of the 12 judges in Godden ruling in favour of the dispensing power. In 1687, James issued the Declaration of Indulgence, also known as the Declaration for Liberty of Conscience, in which he used his dispensing power to negate the effect of laws punishing Catholics and Protestant dissenters. He attempted to garner support for his tolerationist policy by giving a speaking tour in the west of England in the summer of 1687. As part of this tour, he gave a speech at Chester where he said, "Suppose there should be a law made that all black men should be imprisoned. It would be unreasonable, and we had as little reason to quarrel with other men for being of different opinions as for being of different complexions." At the same time, James provided partial toleration in Scotland, using his dispensing power to grant relief to Catholics and partial relief to Presbyterians. In 1688, James ordered the declaration read from the pulpits of every Anglican church, further alienating the Anglican bishops against the Catholic governor of their church. While the declaration elicited some thanks from Catholics and dissenters, it left the established church, the traditional ally of the monarchy, in the difficult position of being forced to erode its own privileges. James provoked further opposition by attempting to reduce the Anglican monopoly on education. At the University of Oxford, James offended Anglicans by allowing Catholics to hold important positions in Christ Church and University College, two of Oxford's largest colleges. He also attempted to force the Protestant Fellows of Magdalen College to elect Anthony Farmer, a man of generally ill repute who was believed to be secretly Catholic, as the president when the Protestant incumbent died, a violation of the Fellows' right to elect a candidate of their own choosing. In 1687, James prepared to pack Parliament with his supporters so that it would repeal the Test Act and the penal laws. James was convinced by addresses from dissenters that he had their support and so could dispense with relying on Tories and Anglicans. James instituted a wholesale purge of those in offices under the Crown opposed to James's plan, appointing new Lords Lieutenant and remodelling the corporations governing towns and livery companies. In October, James gave orders for the Lords Lieutenant in the provinces to provide 3 standard questions to all members of the Commission of the Peace. 1. Would they consent to the repeal of the Test Act and the penal laws? 2. Would they assist candidates who would do so? 3. Would they accept the Declaration of Indulgence? During the first 3 months of 1688, hundreds of those asked the 3 questions who gave hostile replies were dismissed. Corporations were purged by agents known as the regulators, who were given wide discretionary powers in an attempt to create a permanent royal electoral machine. Most of the regulators were Baptists, and the new town officials that they recommended included Quakers, Baptists, Congregationalists, Presbyterians and Catholics, as well as Anglicans. Finally, on the 24th of August 1688, James ordered the issue of writs for a general election. However, upon realizing in September that William of Orange was going to land in England, James withdrew the writs and subsequently wrote to the Lords Lieutenant to inquire over allegations of abuses committed during the regulations and election preparations as part of the concessions James made to win support.